He opens the door expecting accusation, or at least the low, cold hum of a sentence already planned. He steps into the Don's room with his boots still holding the night's grit, and the air folds around him like a question. Tobacco and old wood, and a faint thread of aftershave, that impossible perfume of authority, hangs in the room. A lamp on a heavy desk burns like a small, stubborn sun. Shadow collects in the corners and in the lines cut around the man's eyes. Someone once called this place a nest. To Jackson, it looks like a waiting room for judgment. They want him dead, somebody had said on the drive-in. A rumor, then a threat, then a reason to stop their truck and hold their breath. The words sat in Jackson like a stone. He has been a deputy and a ranch hand. He understands threats carved into silence and the way a town's fear reshapes itself into action. He was not prepared, though, for the stillness of the young man in the chair across from the desk, small as a folded paper bird, damp collar, green eyes like winter river water. The Don looks at him for a long beat. Not the Don of the movies, not a cartoon of power. Older than Jackson, more tired in the places where people are tired of pretending. He studies the boy as if holding up a fragile thing to see if it will break. The room's warmth seems to pool toward him. "Baby," the Don says. The single syllable lands like a verdict and a blessing at once. It could be an indictment. It could be a claim. The room leans forward, waiting to see which. In that stretched breath, Jackson sees a map of possibilities. Violent, safe, both, none. The Don repeats the word with no malice, no calculation on his face that Jackson can read. There is something older than power in it. Recognition, ownership, a strange tenderness that does not ask permission. And then, memory snaps. The Don's room reshapes into another door, another night, and another kind of hush. Earlier that same evening, the road had been a white seam, headlights painted straight lines through falling snow. Jackson had been driving without a plan, no particular destination, only the ache of a house that held too many quiet places where Daniel used to be. The farmhouse at the end of the county road had become, in its silence, a museum to the man he loved. He had thought staying with the ghosts was easier than answering the empty chair. The truck's heater fought the cold like a gruff friend, and the radio offered nothing useful but a country song that could have been about any winter. It should have been empty out there, but a pair of hazard lights stuttered like a heartbeat and refused to die. Jackson first saw them because they refused to let themselves be unseen, a small, blinking absolution on the shoulder where the asphalt met plaster-white drifts. He pulled over, kicking salt from the truck steps, and found the figure slumped under a tarp whose edges clung with rime. Snow had drawn thin, pale lacing across eyelashes. When the boy blinked, the flakes melted into tears, and the look he managed was confusion, then relief. "Hey," Jackson said, close enough for breath to be shared. He made his voice as gentle as he knew how. His own throat had been dry with years of saying the wrong thing. "You all right?" The boy laughed, a small, incredulous sound. Too young to be so alone, sheathed in a jacket with a father's name stitched into the collar. "No, not really." Jackson wrapped the boy in his coat and carried him the way people carry what might break. A body more than a burden, a thing to be cradled rather than corrected. In the truck, the boy curled into the heat like a huddled animal, hands around a paper cup of coffee as if it were a life preserver. "Name's Finn," he said eventually. The name was a little breathy in the cab, and Jackson heard someone, himself maybe, bristle at how young the name sounded in the winter light. Finn had the sort of hands that knew how to hold a brush. They were stained just enough that Jackson could read the rumor of paint on knuckles. He had a small, stubborn set to his jaw, and the story in his mouth tasted like gravel and apology. "Why are you out here?" Jackson asked. It was a question that invited a list. There shouldn't have been an answer that didn't end in a father. "Got dropped off," Finn said. Said he couldn't. The sentence fractured. The final part collapsed into the spaces of the truck's heater. Said he'd put me somewhere safe. Said he'd do it right. He didn't. The father's name, Robert Holloway, landed cold on Jackson's tongue the way a wanted poster settles into a sheriff's hands. Holloway's face, when people spoke it, came wrapped in rumors, debts, slurred promises, a temper that leaned easily toward threats. Jackson had seen Holloway once, at the county fair, too boisterous and then too quiet. He had the type of face that taught other faces to bend away. Jackson's deputy instincts flared. There are ways to track a man like that, ways to thread rumors into proof. But tonight, the boy in his truck was the immediate matter. The farmhouse had been, at first, a place with a name. Daniel's studio smelled of turpentine and lemon oil, the brushstrokes on the canvases frozen in mid-sentence, like a conversation interrupted. Jackson's house held Daniel's things the way a body holds a memory. Careful and practical, boots brushed, coffee mugs aligned, a cowboy hat on the hook as if waiting still to be taken down. Finn wandered the studio as if drawn by a gravity he didn't understand. His fingers hovered over brushes, then clutched an empty canvas like it was a threat or a promise. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Jackson asked, aware the question was small for the problem. Finn shook his head. "No one wants me. Dad..." He swallowed. He said he did, and then he said something like, "Men like us can't be dragged into this," and left. Jackson saw what the father had left in his son's mouth. Shame, dressed as practicality. He also saw the thing Finn did not yet know how to bury, the way his hand went to the empty place where someone might have rested it, how he watched the door for a person he might never expect, but still hoped for. In the stove-clocked kitchen, Jackson made stew, the kind that remembers people who come to table. Smoke curled and settled as if listening. Finn sat at the table with his hands cupped around a warm mug, watching the map of Jackson's good habits, where the knives lived, which cupboard held the tea. Daniel's coat still hung in the hall, the sleeve flattened where someone's hand had been. Jackson watched Finn watch the coat, and he heard himself offer what had never come out of him in the month since Daniel's funeral. "You're welcome here," he said. Finn looked at him like the offer was not a thing everyone can make. "You sure? Jesus, I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," Jackson said. He didn't promise miracles, didn't give the kind of certainty that can be sued in a courtroom. He promised a house. He promised stew. He promised not to let the boy sleep alone on the road again, and that was something he could keep. They pushed the studio door open. The smell of turpentine met them, generous and honest and a little like Daniel. Finn's hand brushed a canvas. He left a thumbprint in wet paint, small and immediate as a footprint in snow. The first night he slept on a cot in the studio with an army blanket over him. Jackson sat in the kitchen and watched the light move across the wall where Daniel had once stood. He felt like a man learning to breathe with the thing he had lost still on his chest. Outside, the wind made itself into a new kind of sound. Inside, a kettle sang like an answering voice. He poured a cup of coffee, and when he held it, he felt hands that were not his own in the back of his throat, warm and human, like an incantation. If this story is speaking to you, stay with us. There's more coming. By morning, the county was awake to small emergencies. Sheriff Miller knew how to ask the right questions without making people feel like evidence. He arrived with the softness of someone who had chosen this small town as his long-term care plan. He took one look at Finn and one look at Jackson, and like most decent men, he let the law be shaped by the contours of mercy. "You're the deputy," Finn said later in the kitchen, stirring too much sugar into his coffee. "I read about you in the paper. You went after Holloway once, didn't you?" Jackson's mouth tightened. The paper couldn't hold what the hunt had left behind, the way his fingers used to find the edges of things. He had been a deputy long enough to know how to separate ideal from outcome. "Used to be," he said. "Things get messy. But if Holloway turned you out, that's a thing we can make right." Holloway, when they found him, was not dramatic. Men like him tend not to be driven by narrative. He sat at the county station with a cigarette gone to white ash and a sheepishness he tried to sell as contrition. He mumbled something about being scared, something about needing to protect himself from talk, and the sheriff read the rest in the lines of his hands. Holloway's ties to a small syndicate, dirtier deals than suits and shiny words, surfaced as if drawn by heat. There were whispers the man had been skimming money, slipping favors. Finn was not involved. Finn's crime was being who he was, but Holloway's fear had been the spark that lit a threatening word into the air. Someone should make sure this disappears. "Should make sure," Jackson muttered under his breath, and the sentence had a taste of the kind of small language people in rural towns use for monstrous ideas. No need to name the monster to identify its shadow. Sheriff Miller arranged for Holloway to be held for questioning. The law did what it could. It could not, however, erase the rumor it had generated. that there might be men with more reach than a county sheriff who would not like Finn's testimony, who would look at a young queer artist and see a problem to be solved. And then, because the world itself has a habit of doubling down on the worst parts of itself, a man in a dark coat came to the door of Jackson's farmhouse late one afternoon. He carried himself with a certainty that rusted the hinges of normal conversation. Finn saw him first from the studio, a silhouette that revised everything. The man did not introduce himself. He leaned against the doorway like he had a right to the threshold, and his mouth began to move in a slow, easy tide that had nothing to do with manners. "You be careful," he said to Jackson without meeting Finn's eyes. Men who walk away from their names sometimes get called back. They didn't know then whether the man's warning leaned toward threat or toward prophecy. His presence was enough to make hands tighten and the house's bones creak. He was not the Don. The Don would come later, in a room that smelled of old money and more complicated grief. This man was a messenger, but his mouth kept a smile like a switchblade. The first week after Finn came, they lived like people who had decided to sustain a fragile garden in a season of freeze. Small acts took on the stature of heroics. Jackson learned how to feed two people again. He learned how to leave a kettle on the stove and remember to take it off, to fill a thermos and tuck it into Finn's knapsack when the boy wanted to make the long trek into town for supplies. Finn learned to duck the long look people in the grocery store gave him, and to speak with a clarity that came from habit and not from armor. He painted on any surface he could find: a blank board, the inside of an old dresser drawer, the back of a crumpled delivery box. Jackson watched him and saw someone carving a place for himself not by demanding it, but by making it visible. Daniel's presence was a kind of scaffolding. He was not an absence that could be replaced. He was a sound Jackson's life had been built around. The studio held his things like a church holds relics, intimate, humming with the energy of a life that could not be entirely folded away. Finn found a box underneath a stack of canvases and opened it reverently. Inside were presents Daniel had never given, letters he had never finished, a small Polaroid of the two of them on a sun-bleached porch. Finn touched the photo as if it was an offering. He had a good face, Finn said quietly. He painted like he trusted paint to tell him how to live. Jackson felt in that moment a fissure in his guard. Grief sharpened what he had left, the ability to recognize a person in need and the stubbornness to stand with them. He learned slowly to talk about Daniel without the room collapsing. He learned to tell the stories that did not carve him open. Finn listened with the fierce politeness of someone who had never had a safe ear. "Tell me about him," Finn would say, sitting on the studio floor with paint under his nails, and Jackson would give him stories, the small ones, the absurd ones, the ones that made a man feel alive again. But the rumor of men who wanted Finn dead did not evaporate because they fed stew and painted portraits. It moved through the county like a weather front. There were anonymous phone calls, static and a voice that was all threat and no borrower of nouns. A spray-painted mark showed up one night on the post at the end of their lane, a crude symbol Finn didn't like the look of. Sheriff Miller sat them down and explained what he could do, the lines of authority and the places they could hold. "We can protect you here," he said, "but if this is bigger..." He left the sentence unfinished with the same promise and the same limit that all practical men hold in their pockets. Then, on a crisp December afternoon, when the sky was the color of a coin and the light cut everything like a promise, a car arrived at Jackson's house. It was better than Jackson had expected, and worse. The car was wide and low and looked like it had been designed by people who believed in power as an aesthetic. Men got out with the economy of people who are used to not being refused. When they entered, they carried themselves like they were in a museum, and everyone else was art to be observed. Finn, who had been painting, set down his brush slowly, as if the motion might be the only thing standing between him and a fall. "Jackson Ryder," the tallest of them said, bending his head as though introducing himself to an old friend. "We heard you had someone stopping by." One of the men reached out with a hand more practiced at agreement than at touch, and made the kind of patting gesture that is meant to say, "We can take care of things, for a cost." Finn's back stiffened. Jackson's shoulders put on the armor they had once learned to wear. Grief had taught him how to hold someone like an armored thing without intending to go back out and break the world for them, and he did not like what these men represented. They left, with a smile that could have been a gun, but they returned twice in the week that followed, and the space in Jackson's chest that used to be made for Daniel felt like something being tested for strain. Jackson went to Sheriff Miller and asked for a check-in plan. Miller offered what he could, extra patrols, a friendly face that would show up at random times. It felt, Jackson thought, like putting a bandage on an ember. It was then that they heard the name, Don Elias Marsh, out of a mouth that had no business saying it. He was not a local. His name came with a dossier of rumor, a man with reach, a man who had grown old while organizing other people's desires, who had a particular way of making people feel small and also strangely tender. People in town whispered about him because town rumor is a kind of prayer. It shapes the world into stories that make sense. Jackson had never wanted to meet such a man. The idea of taking Finn into the orbit of someone who trafficked in power made the hackles rise on his neck. But when the men kept coming, and when the symbol was painted on their post like a challenge they could not name, something in him answered with a precise, stubborn answer. There are times to let the law run, and there are times the law cannot reach. Finn had been cast loose on the road like garbage. Jackson was not willing to let someone else decide what garbage was worth. He found Don Marsh through a crooked set of connections, people who serve as go-betweens in a world where favors are currency and promises have interest. The meeting they arranged was less cinematic and more raw, a house with heavy curtains and the smell of citrus oil in an over-ornate foyer. They were ushered into a room that felt like the belly of an animal, the walls lined with photographs, the air thick enough to be a thing you could touch. Don Marsh sat behind a desk that had the worn polish of decades of hands. He was smaller than Jackson had feared, and older than he had expected. His hands were liver-spotted and still, his hair more salt than pepper. His eyes were the thing that told you where he had been, that softened, dangerous, weary look older men get when the world has not been kind. "Tell me your name," he said. Jackson stated the obvious. He offered no story about heroics. He offered Finn's name like a prayer. The Don listened as if he collected names rather than facts. When he looked at Finn, the room grew thin with expectation. Finn did not look like the kind of person who belonged in a room like that. He leaned forward, fingers worrying a rag of cloth. He had paint under one fingernail and paint on his cuffs like signposts of the life he wanted. For a moment, Jackson feared the word would split the air into something unrepairable. Then the Don smiled. It was not a smile as powerful people smile. It was something smaller and stranger, like recognition. "Baby," he said, and the single syllable shifted the room like a tide. It could have been possessive. It could have been a threat. It could have been affection. It was, for Jackson, the hinge upon which the night turned. That word reframed everything. Jackson had expected an ultimatum or a ledger. What followed was neither. Don Marche's voice was both a comfort and a threat, the kind of voice old men get when they have seen too many options and decide to keep the one that makes the least mess for them. "You keep him," the Don said finally, looking at Finn as if he could measure the boy's heart in the hollows of his bones. "And you keep him safe. You are under my protection as long as you do right by him. No one lifts a hand while I say otherwise." It was an offer. It was also a claim. Jackson felt the weight of it as a thing that would be hard to explain to a magistrate or a crowd. He also felt, in his chest, the kind of relief that comes from someone putting their stake down in the ground beside you and saying, simply, "I am with you." But deals made with men like Don Marche are not costless. The man who had offered them protection had a face that did not hide the ledger of favors and debts. It was an ambiguous safety, a shield that purchased an obligation. Jackson did not like the shape of the world in which his protector was a man of the Don's color, but he could not turn his back on Finn when the threat seemed too big and the law too slow. He took the protection as a necessary evil, like putting on gloves to move a hot can. He accepted the Don's word with an edge of steel in his heart. "You understand," the Don said. "You keep him out of trouble, and I keep trouble out of you. Small price." The Don's men left behind a card with an address and a number and a line of ink that meant more than it said. The town would say later that Jackson had chosen the easier path. Jackson would say that he had chosen the path that kept Finn alive. Back at the farmhouse, Finn painted as if he could sandpaper away the new tensions with color. The brush in his hand was more than a tool. It was a language he could not yet speak aloud. He made portraits of faces he had seen only in passing. A neighbor from the feed store, his own hands, a small self-portrait that caught him with paint in his teeth, and a look of fierce, tender concentration. Jackson watched and learned the vocabulary of patience, waiting for paint to dry, learning how to offer criticism when it was wanted, how to remain a presence rather than a command. The months unspooled. They put up a small tree that first Christmas and wrapped the present they could afford, not much more than a model-making kit and a used set of paintbrushes. Finn, in the glow of string lights, looked at Jackson as if he had invented a whole new species of good. The shackles of old ghosts loosened in time's patient hands. On New Year's, they sat on the porch and watched the fireworks from the town like distant stars. And Finn said, "What happens now, Jackson?" as if the question were an offering. Jackson realized in that quiet moment that the answer was not a plan, but a choice. He could let the world keep sending its men and its risk signs and live inside their outline, or he could fold Finn into his life and accept the uncertainty that came with loving someone who taught him how to choose again. He chose the latter. Legalities lingered like a fog. Holloway's arrest made the paper. His ties to organized dealings came with charges that looked clean on page 24 and messy in life. The sheriff did what he could. Don Marches's protection kept the men who had crooned threats at their door away, for the most part. But there were consequences. A note slipped under their door one night. "Stay in your lane," signed by someone who used ink like a knife. The Don's presence, for all its stretching of safety, had altered them. Jackson found himself at odd hours thinking about the ledger the Don had placed around their neck, about how favors turn into claims. Finn, who had once flinched from a rough word, learned to hold his ground. He began to sell small paintings at a cooperative in town, and people liked the way his colors argued with the light. He started teaching a small art class on Saturdays for kids, which made him glow with a kind of pride Jackson hadn't seen since Daniel's laugh used to fill the kitchen. One afternoon in late spring, as the crocuses were pushing past the last of the snow and the road smelled like something hopeful, a man walked to their porch carrying a small wooden box. He told them he'd seen Finn on the news, the kind of soft attention that comes to a town when a human story becomes something other people can talk about. He wanted to leave something for the boy who got off the highway. Finn opened the box in the warmth of the kitchen light and found donations, knit hats and a thermos, and a handwritten note from someone who had been in his shoes 2 decades earlier. "Take one," it said, "and if you can, leave one for the next." Finn's eyes moistened as he peeled the note from the box. "Someone did this for me," he whispered. Jackson watched him and knew it was time to close the loop. The road that had nearly taken Finn needed a new sign. One cold morning, they drove back out to the place where the hazard lights had blinked, and where Finn had first been a thing someone found on the shoulder. They carried with them a weatherproof box they'd bought at the hardware store, and filled it with wool socks, granola bars, a gift card, a little stack of art supplies. They nailed a small wooden sign to a post. "If you need help, there is a place. Take what you need, leave what you can." Finn hammered the last nail with a concentration that made it look like a poem. When he stepped back, Jackson saw the box under the sign, like a small, stubborn lighthouse. The act was quiet. It was not a rescue narrative for the cameras. It was the creation of a small public kindness. Finn lingered and put his hand on the post as if blessing it. "I don't want anyone to be left like I was," he said. There was no self-pity behind the words now, just a clear-eyed compassion. They left the place changed in the only ways that matter, more generous, a little less alone. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Finn painted a portrait of Jackson. It wasn't a flattering one. It was honest and hungry. Jackson with his hat half off, one shoulder bared like someone who had been taking the world on for too long. The eyes were the thing that stole the room, rendered with the stubbornness of someone who had learned to be tender again. Jackson hung the painting in the studio above Daniel's easel, and the portrait seemed to anchor the room in its own kind of truth. Daniel's picture had the warmth of memory. Finn's portrait had the coolness of possibility. They learned to live around the edges of the Don's promise, never quite dissolving the fact that a man in a heavy coat had once said, "baby." The word, once an unsettling claim, settled into something else. For Finn, it became a reminder that someone had decided he would not be anonymous. For Jackson, it was a measure of how far he was willing to reach for protection, and how far he was willing to go to keep his life clean of favors that left stains. There was, inevitably, a test. A year after the first hazard lights, an old associate of Holloway's showed up in town with a small truck and a list of things he wanted done. He was used to the economy of fear. He thought the Don's name would keep him from being stopped. Sheriff Miller, the quiet lawman who had watched over them like an uncle, intercepted him before his truck could make it to their lane. Words were exchanged. Hushed and practical, they smelled like the kind of battles that win by exhaustion rather than spectacle. The sheriff's intervention kept the man away. The Don's men, who had once been a dark option, had become an empty threat. The Don's protection, in that moment, showed itself less like a shadow and more like an umbrella, perhaps morally suspect, but useful in a storm. On a late summer evening, as the county's long light collected into gold, Finn and Jackson stood in the studio and looked at their life. The open door that had once been cold, the kettle permanently warm,
the paintings cued along the wall like small, sober exclamations. Finn leaned against the table, paint drying on his fingers, and said, "You saved me." "I know it sounds. You saved me too," Jackson interrupted, because it was true in a way he hadn't understood until the kitchen light had been a lamp and not a mausoleum. "You woke me up."
Daniel would have laughed at us, both of us, if he could see how stubbornly we've kept going. They didn't pretend the world was clean. They didn't allow themselves the romance of an easy ending. They allowed instead the steady smallness of everyday goodness, sitting together over coffee in the late afternoons, teaching a kid to mix the exact green he wanted, planting an herb garden against the porch, paperwork with Sheriff Miller, and a long, slow meeting with a counselor who had the right kind of patience. Don Marche remained an ambiguous figure. He came to the farmhouse once that autumn with a small bouquet of garden flowers and a look that said he had been thinking about them in some quiet, unnameable way. He did not make any demands. He did not ask for anything in return. He sat for a while on Jackson's porch and watched the sunset like a man who had given up trying to rearrange the sky. "You are doing right by him," Don Marche said quietly, and the sentence carried the weight of a man who had seen too many people do half-right things. Keep him always. Jackson felt every implication of the promise. He felt the small ligatures of debt and favor, and the way those strings could tangle the best plans. But the words were also a benediction. They had been given protection, and perhaps something like acknowledgement from a world that usually kept these matters secret. The Don called Finn baby again, in that soft, almost paternal way, and Finn smiled the smile people give when they accept that they have been claimed in a world that does not always make room for them. In the end, the place where it had all begun, the shoulder of the road with hazard lights stuttering like a heartbeat, became a place of departure rather than abandonment. They painted the mailbox. They left art supplies in the box. Finn sometimes left a small painting in the weatherproof cavity and a note with a name and a wish, for whoever needs this now. People who passed would slow and look, and sometimes leave a folded dollar or a new pair of gloves inside. The box became a small tradition. Jackson thought of it as an altar to ordinary kindness. Years later, a neighbor's child would point to Finn and Jackson as an answer to an adult's question. What did they do when the world was loud and mean? The child was told a shorter version. A truck stopped, a man took in another man, they built a life. The longer version was messier and more true. A man who had loved and lost learned to stand again with someone who had wandered and been refused. They accepted protection from a man who wore the colors of menace and mercy in equal measure. They fed a community little by little until small pockets of safety opened like doors. On a winter night, not unlike the one Finn had first been found, Jackson sat at the studio's table and watched Finn stand in the doorway. Finn had paint under his nails and a coat with a place for everything, small jars of turpentine, a rag, a sketchbook. Outside, the snow lay soft and assuming. Finn turned to him and touched his cheek like he was checking a temperature. "You ever think it'll stick?" Finn asked quietly. "That this, us, will stick? Not just for now?" Jackson thought of Daniel, of the Don, of Sheriff Miller, of hollow hazard lights and wooden boxes. He thought of the ways protection had been bought and the ways it had been earned. He thought of the many small things that had added up. The stew, the open studio door, the hammering of a tiny sign into a post. He answered in the only language he felt did not make promises he could not keep. "Yeah," he said, "I think it can. It takes work. It takes saying the hard things. It takes paying for promises with more promises. But I think it can." Finn smiled like a sunrise pressing through a cloud. They stood for a long time then, not needing to fill the silence. They had both been saved in different ways. Finn from the road and the abandonment, Jackson from a silence that had been consolidating for years into the shape of a man who could not love again. They had given, between them, a forgiving architecture for the future. Down the road, in a room that had once been the stage for threats and choices, Don Marsh sat alone in the dim light and looked at a small picture someone had left on his desk, a postcard of a harbor with gulls, and a single line penciled on the back. "Thank you." He folded the card and put it in a drawer with other small, anonymous things that accumulated in a life spent being both a menace and a refuge. When Jackson and Finn's story came back to him, he smiled once, a private, complicated smile. and thought about the strange, necessary business of protection. The last image in the story, the one that matters when the rest of the world is asleep, is of two shadows on a porch light, brief and exact. Finn holds a small painting of the very road where he was left, a little scene of a box and a sign and a pair of boots. Jackson's hand finds Finn's in the cold, like a promise finally living up to its name. The porch light washes the scene in a domestic, ordinary holiness. They had entered dangerous rooms and had been named in strange ways. They had been threatened by men who fancied themselves as gods of a small parish of fear. And yet the thing that held, the steady, stubborn work of feeding someone, of letting someone sleep under a roof, of painting someone exactly as they are, proved to be its own kind of law. At the end, when a child asks what made the difference, Jackson would tell, plainly, a truck stop that night. Then, with a crooked, grown-up smile, he would add, and we kept a promise.